I'm sure that the basics of ancient Egyptian culture are familiar to most people, but I want to spend a little time touching on a couple of elements of the society as we begin to examine three of the very interesting cities from ancient Egypt. Ancient Egyptian culture developed in regional clusters along the banks of the Nile in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, that is, from about 5000 BC onward. By about 3200 BC, and that's an important date, because 3200 BC is when the Indus Valley civilization was founded, when Uruk and Ur, the great Sumerian cities, come into their own. It's a remarkable period, actually. It's also when Egypt was unified. The figure of the pharaoh, that is the king of combined Egypt, emerged then about 3200 BC. Pharaohs would rule Egypt until the Assyrian conquest in 664 BC, and then afterwards somewhat sporadically. Now, the pharaoh was at the top of Egyptian society in a very rigid hierarchy. This included a number of elaborate hierarchies of priesthoods, civil officials, and military leaders. All of them helped to run the kingdom of Egypt, but they also served to reinforce the power of the pharaoh, who was technically responsible for the kingdom's flourishing, including ritually responsible for the natural factors that would ensure agricultural success. What that means is the flooding of the Nile. When the Nile flooded, everything went well. The land was fertile and everything was prosperous. If the Nile did not flood, because the pharaoh was responsible for it, he could actually be killed. So the pharaoh takes great responsibility for the success and abundance in ancient Egypt. Well, the city that we're going to look at is called Hetep Senwosret, or Hotep Senwosret. We don't really know, since nobody alive today actually speaks ancient Egyptian, but what it means is Senwosret is pleased. We naturally, being lazy as archaeologists, refer to it by its modern Arabic name, Kahun. It's a lot easier to say. The city was founded in 1890 BC under the pharaoh Senwosret, or as we call him from the Greek, Sesostris. Sesostris II. He's a pharaoh of the 12th dynasty of what we call Middle Kingdom Egypt. Now, we don't know much about Sesostris II, except that we know that during this period, Egypt was at peace, and Sesostris II concentrated his efforts on trade with the Middle East, occupation of Nubian territories, that is what is today modern northern Sudan, and increased agriculture in the Fayum, the fertile oasis area west of the Nile, which we'll actually return to a bit later. The city we're going to look at, Kahun, was built to house the workforce that created his tomb complex among the burial areas in the desert west of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians were smart about land use. They did not build on their farms or their agricultural land. They built out on the edge of the desert. That's where their towns were, on the east side, and on the west, where their tombs were. Now, I need to say something here to try and correct, centuries of misunderstanding. The popular image of multitudes of toiling slaves whipped by overseers laboring to build the monuments of the pharaohs seems pretty much permanently fixed in modern consciousness. I doubt I'll be able to eliminate it just with this lecture, but you should know that it's not true. The tombs and temples of the pharaohs were built by Egyptian workers who were paid for that labor. There's fragmentary evidence, actually, of earlier such communities going all the way back to the Old Kingdom, really to the founding of Egypt. But none of those are terribly well preserved. We have a house or two. At Kahun, in contrast, we have a full city that, when it was excavated in the late 19th century, was preserved all the way up to the roof lines of the houses. Really extraordinary opportunity to study cities in this period. So here at Kahun, we have an entire city laid out in the desert. Really about 3/4 of it is well enough preserved for us to study effectively. It held originally about 9,000 to 10,000 people, and we can really study it, I think, in depth. Like earlier cities, it was almost completely constructed of mud brick, and it also represents the extraordinary control of society that Egyptian central government imposed. even on regular communities like this deep within the kingdom. To start with, the city is walled. Now that may not seem like a great surprise because there have been walled cities since almost the beginning. Jericho was walled back in the early Neolithic. Except that in the case of Kahun, what we have is essentially internal colonization. That is, it's in safe Egyptian territory. It's not on the frontiers. The walls here serve to define the city, but also to control it. In fact, the section of the city given over exclusively to the houses of the common workers is walled separately. Not to keep people out, but to keep people in. Now, I think that this deserves a little attention because when you see this walled section of the city where all the workers live in an area that's just crowded with houses and no common space, you might be tempted to think, well, these people are slaves or they're servants or they're indentured servants. But that's not the case. In fact, having walled neighborhoods in cities is very common in the Near East, really all the way up to the Middle Ages. Neighborhoods are walled separately and the gates are locked at night to keep the populations really in order and away from one another. It's a very stark form of social control that we find here in ancient Egypt and continuing on in the ancient Near East really for centuries. And it's not the only form of social control that we find here. We'll touch on some others as well as we go along. Well, in addition to the walled aspect, city design here at Kahun is actually quite remarkable. City design under Sesostris II shows the earliest use in the history of the world, I should point out, of orthogonal planning and modular design in city construction. Orthogonal planning, that is the use of streets set at right angles and the subsequent creation of square or rectangular city blocks defined by a grid of streets, seems natural to us. We do this all the time. It's not natural. It's a direct byproduct of the Egyptian need to create a structured city environment based on social structure and modular construction. Now, about that modular construction, the second main point here, what that means is when the Egyptians designed and built Kahun, they used modules, small units, houses, or in fact even rooms within houses that were identical. And they just replicated those across the entire city. So the city could be built using a small design that just is replicated as many times as you need for as long as you need to create the space. So it's really an interesting idea that we find nowhere else before this. That brings us actually to the notion of the houses here. And the houses at Kahun are of particular interest in terms of the social structure and social control that we find in ancient Egypt. What we have in the houses at Kahun are two types. There are the houses of the workers, which are regular 6-room houses, and then there are the larger houses of what we might call the overseer or supervisor class. Each type is created around a module, which could be replicated as needed to fill out blocks and really to create the majority of the city. One of the notable features of the city is the division of space within it. And this is very important because this allows us to analyze Egyptian society through the physical remains. We look at the city and we see that it reflects Egyptian society. So the allotment of space and position of key urban components reveals Egyptian priorities and the needs for social control, as the blocks of the workers' houses are separate from the houses of the elite, from what we term the Acropolis, and from the great food storage areas, the vast warehouses that held the food for the entire community. The city was laid out in the desert, as I mentioned, in a rectangle, with the high ground used for what archaeologists have called an acropolis. Now, as anachronistic as the use of that Greek term is, it does describe the prominent place in the city given to its religious architecture. This block, located on the north edge of the city, it's really in the center of the north edge of the city, divided the city between the common areas in the west and the high status areas in the east. And it also served a religious function. So it's the high ground, it's central, it divides the city into two parts, and it serves as a visual focus because up on the Acropolis was a temple to one of the Egyptian gods. Which one is not clear because it's not well preserved, but it's certainly religious space used to project cultural identity and really to define the community. Now, the western third of the city was all of the common houses of the workers, each one of which was about 44 meters square. The eastern two-thirds of the city was taken up with a few additional workers' houses, but mainly with large-scale food storage areas, that is, the warehouse district, and those 10 elite dwellings that I mentioned, the homes of what we might call the overseers. Each of these was about 2,700 meters square, so about 50 times as large as the homes of the common workers, with 10 times as many rooms. Now, when it was discovered, the mud brick city of Kahun had largely collapsed into the desert. But as I said, the material was there up to the roof lines. So its raw materials are in place, along with some domestic goods and papyri, which were still preserved thanks to the desiccation of the dry desert. So from this, the remains, the domestic goods, and the papyri, we can really, I think, reconstruct aspects of the daily life of the city's inhabitants. Now, not all of the construction was mud brick, however. The houses had stone foundations and stone bases for columns that supported the roofs. The columns themselves were made of tree trunks of palm. Palm's great to work with in these cases because it doesn't dry out, it doesn't rot. It's very, very good for long-term building. Now, those common houses consisted of a simple arrangement of 6 rooms in a limited variety of organizations. This always reminds me of the suburb I grew up in, where you had I think there were 4 house plans that were replicated down the street. And the guy 2 doors down from me is in my grade in high school. We went to visit him one time and I realized his house was just like mine, except it was the mirror image. They just reversed the plan for a little variety. That's the idea here. What we have are 6 rooms, and they're kind of reorganized as they went along. We don't know why they chose particular organizations, but they're almost identical. These are all single-story houses with flat roofs, and we believe the roofs were also utilized by the inhabitants for additional space. This is a pattern that persists today in many parts of the Mediterranean and Near East. I myself have used the flat roofs of Mediterranean houses for sleeping, laundry, and dining. You still see this today in Egypt and Greece, and all the way west into Italy, southern Italy. I've seen the same pattern. We suspect that pattern was used at Kahun as well. So we have single-story houses, but really a roof that gives you a second open story. Now, one of the notable differentiations in the city and space, along with the sheer size differential between the common and elite houses, was the width of roads. The width of the roads served to give you a spatial visual clue of significance, that is, privileging of particular space. The main road that ran past the Acropolis, the elite houses, and the food storage areas was about 9 meters wide. The roads that separated the blocks in the workers' houses were only about 1.5 meters in width. So people are living really close together in much smaller spaces. Really, I think, giving them a sense of the constriction as opposed to the grander spaces that they would encounter in the elite dwellings and going to the elite dwellings. So the workers are living in small spaces, tightly packed together, in, frankly, relative deprivation. That is, there are no, as far as we can tell, green spaces or public areas to congregate. It's thought that this was not an oversight, but a deliberate feature on the parts of the Egyptian authorities to ensure another form of control, because it stops workers from gathering anywhere in public. There's no common place for them to gather. In terms of control, however, perhaps the greatest of the social controls was that the common houses have no food storage areas, no place for them to store their own grain, which was actually a common feature normally in houses, and we saw it at Jericho going all the way back to the Neolithic. They also had no provision for their own water. There are no wells, no canals that go past the common houses. This means that the inhabitants in those houses, in the workers' houses, were obliged to rely on the large elite houses of the overseers, not just as houses, but as redistribution centers for provisions, food and water, reinforcing the control over the common workers by their overseers. It's possible, in fact, I believe it's certain, that someone from each worker's household had to go daily to one of the large elite dwellings, wait in line, and collect food and water rations. Whatever the interval of distribution, whether it was daily, weekly, or whatever, such a feature was an effective means of ensuring discipline in the community. People had to show up on regular intervals in these elite dwellings and collect their food from higher authorities. We saw the same thing at Uruk, but in Uruk, those food distribution centers were the temples. We'll see that pattern in Egypt as well in just a bit. I think a great modern parallel is seen in the company towns, in which the company provided and owned the buildings in which workers were required to live. Workers also purchased their food and basic needs from a general store run by the company. The prices in that store could be and were set to keep the workers in an almost perpetual state of really near poverty. I think actually here of the city of Fordlandia. This is Henry Ford's great colonial attempt to create a rubber estate in South America. And what he did was he created a city called Fordlandia, laid out with all the workers' houses and everything really as Henry Ford envisioned as the ideal, and only just what the workers needed. The fact that this city is named for the pharaoh at the time and that he is pleased reminds me also of Fordlandia in that way, that the name is used here. It's also significant, I think, that we have this sort of notion of social control. Again, Fordlandia gives us that idea where the workers are required to live there, required to shop there, required to do everything in work and out in this one space. So I think that's a particularly interesting parallel from something more recent from the 20th century. One distinction between Kahun and Fordlandia is in the architecture, design, and layout. In those matters, in the architecture, design, and layout of the city, it is remarkably similar not to modern company towns, but to contemporary Middle Kingdom fortresses. See, Sesostris II and other Middle Kingdom kings imposed their rule, that is, they projected power into what is known in ancient terms as Nubia. It's modern Sudan. And so they occupied northern Sudan, and to control that area and to really effectively create a frontier on the edges of new Egyptian territory, they built a series of fortresses. These are also built of mud brick, like Kahun, and organized around barracks for the soldiers. So we have largely residential areas. We also have command buildings, which are the equivalent of these elite dwellings at Kahun, and large food storage areas. I think the military structure of these fortresses down in Nubia seems to be the parallel of the civil structure at Kahun. And that gives us a great sense of the overall control and really, I think, close social structure of the Egyptian, all of the Egyptian society. The most interesting of these forts, I think, is at Buhen. It's almost exactly on the border between Egypt and Sudan in modern terms, so it's in northern Nubia, and it gives us one of the best preserved examples. Before the Aswan High Dam was built and Lake Nasser was created, it was almost perfectly preserved. Out in the desert, this mud brick city just sitting there. Really a tremendous city surrounded by fortification walls. It survived almost intact up to the 20th century from its construction in about 2000 BC, so just shortly before Kahun. It's also laid out with orthogonal planning, and it uses modular design for the various components of the city. So the domestic spaces, the storehouses, and the administrative buildings are all laid out in modules. Well, Kahun lacked the impressive defenses of the southern frontier fortresses like Buhen with their corner towers, moats, and multiple lines of walls, but in design it's very similar. And it reveals, I think, the similar approach to Egyptian society by the central government, establishing practical settlements for populations to fulfill particular functions in support of the state and the rulers, whether they are, in this case, workers or, in fact, military. Now, the homes of the elites at Kahun were designed to reward them, to reinforce their status, to provide them with the comforts and perks of their rank, and to be used as redistribution centers for the commodities that passed on to the workers for their provisions. We know a great deal about the houses of these elites, these overseers, from a variety of really interesting sources. First, the remains of the houses themselves. These give us a lot of information about the layout, the organization of rooms, the architecture, and so on. Like much of Egyptian architecture, both religious and domestic, they're rectangular in form, with a central core of rooms about the central third of the house, organized with all the important rooms along the central axis, from a door in one of the short ends of the rectangle to the most important space across the length of the house at the opposite end, along the other short end. This means that anybody who came into the house, that is visiting those inhabitants there, presumably seeking an audience with the overseer or coming to collect provisions, had to cross the entire length of the house. They had to effectively penetrate this elite space themselves in order to get what they wanted. And as they do, they're surrounded by this space that reinforces the status of those elite individuals. This is, I think, is carefully designed. Now at Kahun, this core of rooms, that central core, included open spaces such as courtyards, a feature that we don't find in the workers' houses. Often these courtyards had a covered walkway along one side, supported by a line of columns, so a portico along one side. These interior spaces were walled gardens. They allowed air and light into the surrounding rooms, and they served to allow for the collection of water. During the very infrequent but heavy rains that would occur, they have pools in the center that ran into cisterns. They're planted with planting beds and trees, so they're really quite extraordinary, luxurious spaces for these overseers. The 2/3 of the home to the left and right are lower status spaces that really supported that central core of elite rooms. These included food storage and preparation rooms, as well as servants' quarters and rooms really to support the household in everything, to manufacture local goods, to really do everything that you needed to maintain the status of the elites. In the best preserved of these houses, there's a long double hallway that runs most of the length of the house, from an entrance on the short end to what seems to be a reception space adjacent to the largest of the food storage areas. This may be, in fact, I think it is, where the common workers came for their rations. They'd go up one long hallway, waiting in line, to the reception room at the very end of the house where food was distributed, and they would exit down the second long, dark hallway to the same narrow door that they entered. Now, I can't say for sure, but I suspect that the 10 elite houses in the east part of the city represent the overseers of specific subdivisions of the workers, who would report to their overseers' houses for rations, thus reinforcing the command and control of the overseers, and by extension, the system they were all part of. So what we might think of is every group of workers reporting to their own overseer. So they'd get their food from them, they'd get their orders from them. When they went out of the city to work on the tomb, they would all work as a group. And this really created this tight sense of, I think, control in every aspect of their lives. Now, another interesting source of evidence of the form of the elite houses is provided by the tomb architecture of these officials. These are designed literally as houses for eternity, and that's actually a direct translation of one Egyptian term for the tomb, house of eternity. These tombs were often built with the same features that are apparent in the floor plans of the houses at Kahun. But the tombs allow us to reconstruct accurately the forms of the houses above the foundations because they're for eternity. So instead of being made of mud brick, they're cut out of stone. Sometimes cut blocks of stone, and other times they're carved directly out of cliff faces, so really permanently in the rock. For no structural reasons, they're often cut with faceted or fluted columns supporting the roof, that is, the cave that they're cut out of. And they also cut beams, roof beams, that run across the roofs or the ceilings of these. This is a form of what I term architectural sclerosis, or hardening of the architecture. And it preserves the forms of the houses in solid rock. So we get a sense of what these look like, not just from the remains, but from the tombs themselves. Some of the tombs have entrances that actually reflect the houses, with a central door between two columns, showing the importance of that central axis on the short end of the house. Now, how the space in these houses was used is not revealed by the house remains themselves or even by the tombs. So those don't themselves tell us what they're doing in each particular room. For the use of particular rooms and the organization of work within them, we turn to a third piece of evidence, and that is the wooden models that have been found in Middle Kingdom tombs. There have been dozens of these found, and they're really extraordinary. Detailed models that are, well, frankly, almost perfectly preserved in the desiccated desert air. And they're used actually to ensure that the deceased had the food, shelter, and servants that reflected their status in this world and carried on into the next. See, the model houses and the servants within them would magically serve the dead for all eternity. It's a kind of sympathetic magic that's like voodoo dolls, another form of sympathetic magic. This ensured that the current earthly status of these overseers would be eternal. One of my favorite of these models resolves a problem that archaeologists have had about a standard set of rooms that are found in these elite houses. We didn't understand the purpose for this set of 9 rooms with no doorways. It's very curious. 9 rooms set together, no doors. How do you get into them? What do you do in them? Well, the model that's found in a tomb shows a line of workers carrying sacks of grain up a ladder until they're standing on the wall separating 2 sets of enclosed rooms. Then they empty the sacks into the rooms, all under the eye of an overseer and 2 scribes. The enclosed rooms that we find in these houses, therefore, are granaries. And they're designed this way to keep out vermin and to protect the grain. So if you have a solid room, you keep the rats out. And so the tomb model served to really give us the evidence necessary to understand what was going on in the house itself. Another common form of model shows 2 narrow rooms full of workers, all busy at a variety of tasks. These models represent brewery bakery buildings, and these give us the details of the processing of that stored grain into the dietary staples of beer and bread, the 2 things that are probably distributed in bulk to the workers. The operations of this combined brewery bakery are overseen by a soldier standing in the corner, armed with a spear and a shield. Apparently, the tradition of loss prevention officers guarding businesses against employee theft goes back at least to the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, because that soldier is actually watching the workers. He's not looking outside. But one of the most important of these tomb models for recreating the city shows the courtyard of an elite house, with the colonnade along one side, a row of trees around the edge of the courtyard, and a pond in the center, probably water collected from rains. Given the climate of Egypt, it looks like an ideal retreat from the heat and dust of the desert, and it gives us a sense of the luxuries of these overseers' houses. Now, that armed soldier I mentioned in the bakery brewery model represents a category of worker we know who lived at Kahun in one of the city's small houses. Thanks to the finds of papyri from the site, we can trace the occupants of one house over 3 stages of change in a fairly short period of time. That is, we can trace 3 really generations of occupation in that one house. The house that we have evidence for was occupied by a soldier, Hori, his wife, Shepset, and their son, Snefru. They were then at some point joined by Hori's mother and father, Jehudi and Harekni, and his 5 younger sisters. In the final phase of the house's occupation that we know of, Shepset lives in the house with her son, Snefru, her mother-in-law, Harekni, and 3 of the sisters-in-law. Snefru is now a soldier, like his presumably deceased father. The occupation of this domestic space by multiple generations of an extended family suggests that it was considered a family home, not just an assigned sleeping space. Additional evidence of occupation, if not ownership, by a family is provided by infant burials found under the floors of many of the workers' houses. This is a common practice in the ancient world, and one thought to represent a desire to keep these infants within the family that is defined by the house itself. In that way, it differs somewhat from the adult skulls found under the houses at Çatalhöyük and Jericho, which are thought to have represented ancestor worship rather than to reflect social obligation towards these infants. It's also clear that the city was not just for workers, but for their families as well, meaning that it probably changed over time, just as company towns did, when their workers married and raised families. Like other company towns in the 19th and 20th century, Kahun eventually became a ghost town as the workers completed their tasks, creating the tomb complex for Sesostris II. For a different and longer-lasting model community, we can turn our attention to a new kingdom workers' village, the village of Setmat, subject to the next lecture. Despite its ephemeral occupation, Kahun preserves the earliest orthogonal and modular city planning known on Earth. It also foreshadows the planned obsolescence of certain urban areas, such as company towns, around exploitation of natural resources, mining or timber, for example, or short-term communities familiar to us from such examples such as Olympic villages.